Kapilavattu. Lord, this Kapilavattu was rich, prosperous, full of people, crowded with men and thickly populated. When one entered Kapilavattu in the evening after having visited the Lord or the worthy monks, one meet with elephants, horses, chariots, carts and people all swaying and rolling along. 1. Kapilavattu was the chief town of the Sakyans and the place where Prince Siddhartha spent the first 30 years of his life. Centuries before the Buddha's time, King Okaka expelled his oldest son so that on his death he could give the throne to his youngest son. The exiled princes made their home near the foot of the Himalayas beside a lotus pond in a grove of saka trees, Tectonia grandis, the Indian teak. When King Okaka asked his ministers where his sons had gone, they told him and he exclaimed, "They are as strong as sakas, these princes, they are real Sakyans." This, according to legend, is how the Sakyans got their name. Near the prince's new home was the hermitage of the sage Kapila, and so they called their settlement Kapilavattu. Later Buddhist literature describes the Buddha's father as a great king and Kapilavattu as a magnificent city. In fact, Suddhodana was more like a senior Sakyan chief while Kapilavattu was probably a small town built around Suddhodana's manor house. The Buddha's first return to his hometown after his enlightenment was very eventful. He shocked his father by begging in the streets, he preached to large crowds, and several of the Sakyans ordained as monks. 2. Of course not everyone was impressed. Dandapani asked the Buddha to explain his Dhamma, but on hearing it he went away shaking his head, wagging his tongue, with his brow creased into 3 wrinkles. 3. On another of his visits to Kapilavattu, the Buddha was invited to open the new assembly hall. Carpets were spread on the floor, seats were got ready, water vessels were put out and oil lamps were hung up. The Buddha washed his feet before entering, sat down against the central pillar facing the east, and gave a talk that went far into the night. 4. One of the Buddha's most enthusiastic patrons was Mahanama, to whom several of the Buddha's discourses were addressed. Once Mahanama visited the Buddha at the Nigrodharama, but as he was recovering from an illness at the time, Ananda spoke on his behalf. 5. According to later accounts, Kapilavattu was destroyed sometime before the Buddha's final nirvana. The Sakya country was a semi-autonomous chiefdom within the kingdom of Kosala, and at one time, Pasenadi, the king of Kosala, decided to strengthen his influence amongst the Sakyans by marrying a Sakyan noblewoman. The idea of having one of their own marrying outside the tribe horrified the proud Sakyans, but they could hardly ignore the wishes of their powerful neighbor. Mahanama came up with a solution. He had fathered a daughter named Vasabhakatiya by a slave woman and suggested this girl be given in marriage to King Pasenadi. The ploy worked. The slave girl was accepted as a Sakyan noblewoman, taken to Savatthi, married into the Kosalan royal family, and eventually gave birth to a son who was named Vidutaba. When Vidutaba grew up, he wished to visit what he thought were his relatives in Kapilavattu, but his mother discouraged him from going, as she knew that the Sakyans would be unable to bring themselves to treat him with respect. Eventually he went and was bewildered by the cool reception he received. After leaving, one of Vidutaba's retinue returned to retrieve a forgotten weapon and saw a slave woman washing the seat which Vidutaba had sat upon with milk and contemptuously referring to him as the offspring of a slave. When he inquired what she meant, she told him. When the whole story got to Vidutaba, he was furious and vowed revenge. "Let them pour milk over my seat to purify it. When I am king I will wash the place with the blood of their hearts." And so it was. On 3 occasions, Vidutaba set out with an army to seek his revenge on the Sakyans, but each time the Buddha was able to avert disaster. But eventually Vidutaba got his way. Large numbers of the Sakyans were massacred and Kapilavattu was razed. According to the Mahavamsa Taika, the surviving Sakyans fled into the hills where they built a town called Marianagara. When Fahen came, the place was nearly deserted. All was mound and desolation. Of inhabitants, there were only some monks and a score or two of families of common people. At the spot where the old palace of Suddhodana stood, there have been made images of the prince and his mother. He was shown small stupas marking the places where important events in Prince Siddhartha's early life occurred. Fa Hien also mentions the distance and direction of Lumbini from Kapilavattu. The site that confronted Huyen Tsiang when he visited Kapilavattu was similar. The capital is overgrown and in ruins. Its circuit cannot be accurately measured. The royal precincts within the city measure some 14 or 15 li round. They were all built of brick. The foundation walls are still strong and high. It has been long deserted. The inhabited villages are few and far between. Like Fa Hien, Huyen Tsiang also gives the distance he had to go and the direction he had to head to get to Kapilavattu. It seems that after its destruction, Kapilavattu was never fully rebuilt or inhabited again. The surrounding forest swallowed up agricultural land, the population declined, and it was only the few devout monks who lived there and the pilgrims who came to visit from time to time that kept the town alive. However, there must have been at least intermittent habitation, for we read of a monk living there in the 4th century who repaired one of Kapilavattu's stupas with funds provided by the king of Sri Lanka. As Buddhism declined in India and the stream of pilgrims dried up, the forest closed in and Kapilavattu was lost. Towards the end of the 19th century, most of the sites associated with the Buddha's life had been discovered, all that is except Kapilavattu. With the gradual clearing of the forests on the India-Nepal border, a number of mounds, obviously the remains of ancient habitations, came to light, and scholars began to speculate about which of them might be Kapilavattu. In 1858, Lassen suggested that the remains of the town might be at a site a few kilometers from Gorakhpur. After his successful identification of Savatthi in 1863, Cunningham, using the itineraries of the Chinese pilgrims, declared that Kapilavattu was at Nagarkas, one of the few times he turned out to be wrong. A.C.L. Carlile, one of Cunningham's assistants, surveyed Busti and Gorakhpur districts in 1875–76 in a determined effort to settle the question once and for all, and came to the conclusion that a place called Bailati must be Kapilavattu. By this time, the professional jealousies of scholars had been excited and a race developed to be the first to rediscover Kapilavattu. In 1896, a Führer discovered Asoka's pillar marking the Buddha's birthplace at Lumbini, a momentous discovery in itself, but as the Chinese pilgrims had also given the direction and distance of Lumbini from Kapilavattu, that meant that the identification of the town was imminent. Führer declared, "The discovery of the Asoka Edict pillar in the Lumbini Grove at Ramindii enabled me to fix also, with absolute certainty, the site of Kapilavattu and the sanctuaries in its neighborhood." Titorakat, a collection of ruins in Nepal 22 kilometers northwest of Lumbini, Führer proclaimed, was Kapilavattu, although some scholars disputed the claim. The year 1897 saw Führer again fighting his way through the jungle, looking for evidence to prove his claim. As none could be found, he decided to manufacture it. He excavated, or rather demolished, some structures near Tillarakat and claimed that they were the stupas built over the remains of the Sakyans who had been massacred by the Dudaba. He was busily carving pre-Mauryan letters on some of the bricks, which, if genuine, would have proved his case conclusively, when the famous historian Vincent Smith turned up and caught him in the act. In 1898 an English landlord, W.C. Pepe, dug a deep shaft into the middle of what he thought was a stupa near the village of Piprahwa on the Indian side of the border about 13 kilometers from Lumbini. He found a huge stone box weighing 669 kilograms, and when he lifted the lid a most amazing sight awaited him. Inside was a tiny crystal casket with a beautifully carved fish as a handle, and containing golden stars, a soapstone casket, dishes, vases, and numerous other items. But the most spectacular find was a second soapstone casket 15 centimeters high with letters inscribed on it. The inscription reads, Sukiti behatinam sa behaginikanam sa puta dalanam ayam salilanidane Buddha sa behagavate sakinam. When scholars later deciphered the inscription, which remains the earliest decipherable writing ever found in India, two different translations were posited. The first was that the burnt bones within the casket were those of the Buddha, placed there by the Sakyan Sakiti, his brothers, sisters, sons, and wives. The second was that the bones were those of the relations of the Buddha, the Sakyan Sakiti, his brothers, sisters, sons, and wives. The first meaning has now been established with certainty, but at that time the two different possible meanings only kept the controversy about Kapilavattu alive. If the bones were those of the Buddha, some scholars said, then the Piprahwa Stupa must be the one built by the Sakyans at Kapilavattu. If they were the bones of the Sakyans massacred by Vidutaba, then the stupa was probably situated at the place the Sakyans settled after Kapilavattu was destroyed. Adding to the difficulty was the fact that the location of the town given by Fa Hien and Huyen Tsiang seemed to be quite different. The great Buddhist scholar, T.W. Rhys Davids, came up with a rather strange solution. Perhaps, he suggested, Fa Hien and Huyen Tsiang had been shown two different Kapilavatthus. Perhaps Tillarakat was the original Kapilavattu and Piprahwa was the new Kapilavattu built after the original town's destruction. And so the debate continued, attracting less and less interest as time went by. Then in 1970, Venerable Dharmakirti of Nagar wrote to Mrs. Indira Gandhi, describing the neglected state of Piprahwa and appealing for its excavation and restoration. The letter was forwarded to the Director General of the Archaeological Survey with a note that immediate action should be taken. The motives behind this move were not entirely disinterested. For some time Nepal had been insisting that Kapilavattu was in its territory. If the controversy over the exact location of Kapilavattu could be settled once and for all, and if the question could be settled in India's favor, national pride and the already large number of Japanese pilgrims who were coming to India would both receive a considerable boost. Excavation at Piprahwa started in January 1971 under the direction of K.M. Srivastava. In 1973, after a series of extremely exciting finds, a sealing was unearthed which included the name Kapilavatthu. More such sealings were subsequently unearthed, leaving no doubt that Prince Siddhartha's hometown had at last been discovered. The remains of Kapilavatthu are in two locations, Ganwaria and Piprahwa, about a kilometer from each other. The former represents the actual town of Kapilavattu, and although structures dating from the Buddha's time have been found, being made of timber and mud, most of these have been obliterated by the frequent inundations that have affected the area since ancient times. Piprahwa represents the religious center that grew up around the stupa the Sakyans built to enshrine the Buddha's relics. The distance between the two sites may be due to the stupa having been built at one of the parks donated to the Buddha, like the Nigrodharma, which are known to have been some distance from the town. What to see? Sakyan Stupa. The most important structure at Kapilavattu is the main stupa. Excavations conducted in 1971 revealed that the stupa was first built in the 5th century BCE and enlarged at two later dates. The first and earliest stupa was made from baked bricks and consisted of a simple dome with a 5-meter wide brick-paved processional path around it. In the center of the stupa, at ground level, were two brick chambers adjoining each other. The northern chamber contained a beautifully lathed soapstone casket 12 centimeters high, and two dishes. The southern chamber contained a similar, larger casket 16 centimeters high, and two more dishes. Both caskets, when opened, were found to contain fragments of charred human bone. The date, location and contents of these caskets make it almost certain that the charred bones are the corporeal remains of the Buddha, which had been given to the Sakyans. These precious relics together with the caskets are now displayed in a special display case in the National Museum in New Delhi. 6. The second stupa was built about 150 years later, after leveling the dome of the first. The dome of this stupa was 19 meters in diameter and had a 1.52 meter wide projection around its base. It was from this stupa that Pepe recovered the famous inscribed casket. Having found the huge stone box with the casket in it, he assumed that there were no more relics and thus dug no deeper, missing the other two older caskets only a few meters further down. The third stupa, with its dome 23 meters in diameter, was considerably larger than the earlier ones and had a square base with sides 23.5 meters long added. Pepe found a casket in this stupa also, but it had been smashed into tiny fragments. It is this third stupa that the pilgrim sees today. Apart from its historical importance, the Sakyan stupa is of interest for several other reasons. The earliest stupa showed no signs of having been opened after its construction, thus suggesting that the legend about King Asoka opening all but the Ramagama stupa may not be entirely true. It is possible that he left the stupa at Kapilavattu untouched out of respect for the Sakyans. The stupa also displays the various stages of development that such monuments usually went through. The earliest structure was small and simple, and was added to over time, gradually becoming larger and more complex. Thus many stupas display the onion effect, one structure encased within another larger, later one. Eastern Monastery. A little to the east of the stupa are the ruins of a large monastery. A seal found in this monastery had the words Kapilavatthu Bhikkhu Sangha on it, proving conclusively that Piprahwa and the surrounding ruins were the site of the Buddha's hometown. It also pointed to the monastery having been built by King Kanishk. The monastery consists of 31 cells built around a courtyard. The larger rooms on either end of the eastern side were probably storerooms, while the others would have provided accommodation for monks. The monastery had steps at its entrance and a drain, probably a urinal, with its outlet on the northeast corner. Other ruins. Other ruins in the area consist of what is believed to be a public hall a little to the north of the main stupa, a small votive stupa and monastery on its south side, and another monastery soiree distance to the west. Salargarh and Ganwaria. There are numerous ruins around Kapilavattu, but only two of there have ever been excavated. About 200 meters to the east of Piprahwa through the fields at a place called Salargarh are the remains of a small monastery and stupa all surrounded by a wall. It seems to have been inhabited between the 2nd century BCE and the 2nd century CE. About a kilometer south of Piprahwa is another collection of ruins probably representing the actual town of Kapilavattu. The mound marking the town is extensive, although much of it is now under cultivation. Excavation has shown that the town was occupied from 800 BCE up to the end of the Kusana period, about 300 CE. Today one can see two large monasteries and a collection of secular structures, most of them built after the 1st century CE. How to get there? Kapilavattu is 8 kilometers from Bergpur, which is connected by a good road to Nagar, the nearest town of any size. Nagar can be reached by train or bus from Gorakhpur.